Story is everything. Coming up with that much-lauded new and fresh idea can be challenging, and sometimes can take years to find, and that's exactly what happened with Godzilla Singular Point. Singular Point is the latest Japanese entry of the Godzilla franchise, and it internationally debuted on Netflix this past summer. The video that you are about to watch will be exploring the very long journey it took to craft the narrative of this show. From its origins that predate Shin Godzilla, through the twists and turns it took the production staff to finally crack the general outline. You will also be hearing from several experts and enthusiasts alike: Kevin Derendorf, John LeMay, Patrick Galvan, and Monstrosities livestream regular Rainey, who will be offering key insight and knowledge into the worlds of both anime and Godzilla productions. But before we do this, I have to ask, please subscribe to Monstrosities Tokusatsu Vlog. It is undeniably through the huge support of subscribers like you that allow us to continue to make videos like these. Now, with that said, please sit back and enjoy the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. Piecing together the creative process behind Godzilla Singular Point's story is as much of a puzzle as anything that actually appears in the show itself. There is no comprehensive article or video, at least as of yet, that neatly lays out the entire history for easy consumption. Thus, many interviews, articles, live streams, video commentaries, and more were translated and scoured over in order to compose something of a cohesive narrative for the purpose of this video. Even then, there are conflicting accounts of the hows and whens, and many times no answers as to the whys. Speculation, expert opinion, and best guesses will pop in to fill in those gaps, but the goal here is to stick as closely to the facts as possible.
Anime is very popular all over the world right now.
We've definitely seen its popularity explode in the West, with so many streaming services now putting money towards acquiring new services or even commissioning them. Netflix in particular has opened up anime to the world, where it sits along like normal TV shows and movies in the recommendation bar. Completely different from the past, where someone would have to sign up for a targeted service like Crunchyroll, Funimation, that sort of thing.
There's a limitless possibility in terms of what you can represent in animation. You don't have to worry about budgeting to the same extent that you would have to in order to do something in live action. Because of that, Japanese animation, especially in genres like science fiction, have really just skyrocketed, and frankly, it's a little surprising that Toho hasn't leveraged Godzilla more in the field of Japanese animation.
A Godzilla anime TV show. It would run 13 30-minute episodes, which would later be re-edited into a theatrical film. Though Toho Studios likely conceived this idea earlier, the company actively began to gather staff for the project sometime in 2013 or 2014, with the hiring of directors Kobun Shizuno, who had made his name through several Detective Conan films, and Hiroyuki Sashida, the director of the 3D animated Knights of Sidonia. The project also added the star power of writer Gen Urobuchi, the co-creator of Madoka Magica and the writer of Toei's Kamen Rider Gaim. The anime adaptation was originally planned to expand the possibilities of Godzilla, said director Sashida to Da Vinci Magazine in 2017. The first concept was how to make a Godzilla that could be enjoyed by people who were not interested in tokusatsu but might watch anime. Given a huge amount of creative freedom, the Godzilla anime team began to develop their show, giving it a setting in a far apocalyptic future where humanity had nearly been wiped out by Godzilla itself. But then, in 2016, everything changed.
Shin Godzilla is definitely, from a historical standpoint and a cultural standpoint, probably by far the most interesting Godzilla film made in 30 or so years.
If you look at Toho's projected profits for 2016, they were looking at making about 22 billion yen. And thanks to two movies, Your Name and Shin Godzilla, in the same year, their actual profits were 33 billion yen. So that's 50% increase over their projection, which is monumental.
I think it won 7 awards at the Japanese Academy Prizes, including Best Picture, and the ticket sales was upwards of 5 million.
It's the most attended Godzilla movie since the 1960s and brought a whole new audience, a whole new set of fans into the franchise and into the character.
It wasn't just Godzilla fans saying, hey, let's go see this. It was ordinary moviegoers saying, hey, there's a new film, Shin Godzilla, let's go see this film. The Godzilla franchise, for about 15 or so years before that was kind of anachronistic with the Japanese main going public. Sure, there are otaku and hardcore Godzilla fans in Japan, but the tricky thing is getting the general audience to say, hey, let's go see this new kaiju film, let's see this new Godzilla film.
It really resonated with issues that modern Japanese people were thinking about. On that end, it became part of the cultural zeitgeist. This has really just turned the Godzilla franchise on its head.
The success of Shin Godzilla suddenly had Toho rethinking their Godzilla anime TV plans, and to capitalize on the sudden boom of popularity, the 13-episode anime was reorganized into a trilogy of motion pictures that would debut the following year in 2017. But Toho did not abandon the idea of a Godzilla anime TV show. In fact, as Godzilla Monster Planet, the first of the new anime movies, was being worked on, Toho restarted the project. It would share many of the same characteristics as its predecessor, a 13-episode framework, the use of 3D CG animation, and the want to appeal to non-Godzilla fans through a new storytelling medium. At the core of this new Godzilla anime series would be producer Takashi Yoshizawa, the Toho animation producer who was also overseeing the Godzilla anime trilogy. It would also be his mission to form a production committee, essentially a short-term company made up of other companies who have invested into the production itself. As the article, The Fascinating World of Anime Production Committees, points out, these investments help to minimize the risk to any one company by spreading costs while allowing them to make money in their field of expertise. For their investments, these companies would be granted certain rights in their respective fields: domestic release, international distribution, so in this case Netflix, merchandise licensing, and the like. Rather than going expressly with 3D CG animation as the Godzilla anime trilogy was doing, it was decided this new show would be a combination of both 3D CG and 2D hand-drawn animation, with animation studios Bones and Orange taking the lead.
Studio Bones has been around for about 2 decades at this point, so I think most people would have heard at least one series that they've worked on. Older anime fans would have definitely heard about at least Ouran High School Host Club and Full Metal Alchemist, while newer fans would be more familiar with My Hero Academia and Mob Psycho 100.
Tokusatsu fans will likely be interested in a handful of other projects that they've done. Things like The Skullman, which was based on Shotaro Ishinomori's sort of proto-Kamen Rider. They have a series called Hisone and Maso-tan, or it's called Dragon Pilot in the US. This was produced by Shinji Higuchi for Netflix.
Bones doesn't tend to have any one particular genre they stick to, but they are very well known for their action scenes, and in the case of Mob Psycho 100, they're also very willing to try different things to achieve something really interesting and new as well.
Moving on to Studio Orange, they were founded in 2004, and they're basically a CG animation studio.
So they started out making, providing assets for various shows, but they have done a couple series on their own, like Beastars and Land of the Lustrous, which I think more people should check out because it's amazing.
Both of those shows were made with Toho Animation. Orange sort of started getting work with Toho on their very first show, Majestic Prince, which is a mecha show, so Orange did the CGI animation for that.
With the production committee set, Toho and Studio Bones went looking for a director, and in March of 2017, they offered the job to Atsushi Takahashi.
Takahashi has been working in the industry for just a little over 2 decades now. A lot of people start as animators, but Takahashi definitely seemed interested in being a director from the get-go. And he got his big break by directing Ride Back in 2009, which is about an injured ballerina that comes across a motorcycle-like robot fusion thing. The series combined 2D and 3D animation in ways others had never been able to do before, and really well as well.
Takahashi's also on some fan radars for the Blue Exorcist film. It's based on a manga by Kazue Kato, who did the Godzilla Singular Point character designs. Takahashi was an assistant director on the Oscar award-winning film Spirited Away, the Studio Ghibli picture, which Godzilla Singular Point monster designer Eiji Yamamori worked on. So he's directed a bunch, but he's also a prolific storyboarder on big titles like My Hero Academia and Mob Psycho 100.
It's a little hard to say what Takahashi is like as a person, but to me he seems like the sort of person that's good at recognizing talent and making sure to bring out the potential in shows by surrounding himself with those talents.
It was Takahashi's Doraemon movie, Nobita's Great Adventure in the Antarctic, which was also distributed by Toho Studios, that caught the eye of producer Yoshizawa. The film was a well-researched and well-produced movie. The balance between the quality of the film's production and its entertainment value made it a perfect match for this project, and that's why I offered the job to him, Yoshizawa said in a CG World interview. Along with the job offer, Studio Bones and Toho also proposed an initial story which Takahashi recalled in an interview with GetNews.jp. They asked, "Would you make a Godzilla TV show for us? Would you make a show featuring Godzilla fighting monsters from around the world?" This was their offer to me. The initial Bones Toho story pitch sounds remarkably similar to that of 2004's Godzilla Final Wars, the finale of the Millennium-era films which saw Godzilla globetrotting and kicking various kaiju butt. While critically a flop, the movie arguably offered the most action ever seen in a Godzilla movie up to that point.
When you talk about Toho approaching Takahashi about doing a Godzilla series where he just kind of goes around the world fighting monsters, I mean, on the one hand, I like that, but on the other hand, that has been done a lot on the previous Godzilla animated series, you know, because you had the Hanna-Barbera, that's basically what he did, which I love that. And that's also what he did in Godzilla the Animated Series from Fox Kids.
While this obviously can be done very well, if you look at Godzilla the series, it's something that has been done very well if you look at Godzilla the series. So I can understand a director looking at that and thinking, oh, I don't want to just repeat what's already been done before.
I think it's wise that they went with something more serialized with an ongoing story.
I think it was a good first idea, but I'm kind of glad it was dropped.
This idea might have been the initial production proposal for the Godzilla anime series, a document created to sell staff and producers on a new project's premise. Production proposals can be very detailed or incredibly vague, and often do not set story details in stone. Takahashi eventually accepted the director job, but he wondered if Godzilla battling monsters around the world would be enough for this new anime series. Would it be more interesting to maybe pursue a different approach? Luckily for Takahashi, the job offer also came with it some incredible creative freedom. The offer was, any approach is fine as long as it's Godzilla, Takahashi told Eiga magazine. I could do whatever I wanted. Even with incredible creative freedom, the pressure was high for director Takahashi. For one, he admittedly had no specific story ideas when he took the job. Secondly, he found the very idea of Godzilla challenging, an inconsistent character with so many variations across nearly 7 decades worth of media. And lastly, he would have to follow the order of Toho and find a story that would appeal to young audiences as Shin Godzilla had before. It's hard for new people to get into a work that has a strong core audience, and if it is made too maniacally for a specific fan base, the hurdle becomes even higher. But if you make a work for new fans, you will lose your old fans. I thought it was difficult to find the right balance. I was more concerned about whether the tokusatsu fans would actually watch the anime when it was made. In the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook, Takahashi mentions 2 early ideas he had. One of them almost sounded like an Expendables vs Godzilla scenario, where an alliance of the world's strongest soldiers would gather to fight Godzilla. Takahashi admitted that this was one of his more childish ideas. However, Takahashi's second scenario was something that may have been more seriously considered, and it was unlike anything yet seen in the Godzilla franchise. The music for Godzilla Singular Point was done beautifully by composer Kan Sawada, who had first worked with director Takahashi on his Doraemon movie. The two quickly became friends, as they both loved science fiction and were also like-minded creatives. He would frequently understand my references and explanations and helped everything flow smoothly, Takahashi said while explaining his professional relationship with Sawada. I was very lucky to have someone so like-minded close to the production. The men would frequently get lunch and go out drinking together, and it was during one of these outings, in 2017, that Takahashi let Sawada in on a little secret. Casually, when we were drinking, he said, "There's a possibility I might be doing Godzilla soon. Can you do the music?" I was like, huh? Sawada explained on the Godzilla Singular Point Climax Memorial livestream. Sawada further elaborated on this night in the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook. Back then, he just jokingly told me that they would be remaking Godzilla, this time set in the Edo period. While Sawada remembers the story set in Japan's Edo period, an era of peace and stability that began with the rise of the shogunate in 1603, Takahashi discussed this very idea in the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook, placing the story squarely in the Sengoku period, or Warring States period, that occurred between 1467 to 1615. Godzilla would appear during the Warring States period in Japanese history and have different political warrior factions fight against it. Unlike the Edo period, the Sengoku period was rife with civil war and political strife, a far more exciting setting for a story. Takahashi also mentions how this idea would be like the Samurai Kakeibo, a non-fiction history book that was published in 2003. Samurai Kakeibo gives an incredibly detailed account of samurai life from 1842 to 1879 through a collection of account books and letters. Perhaps this would have been the narrative style of Takahashi's Godzilla vs Samurai concept.
So samurai and period pieces have been sort of the backbone of Japanese entertainment for as long as there's been Japanese entertainment. But in recent years, you do see fewer productions that are sort of focused around these period pieces. You see a lot more science fiction, a lot more modern types of pieces. So it's tempting to say that they're losing ground.
I'm not an absolute authority on this, but my understanding is that, for the last, I'd say 30 or so years, Jidaigeki is not extraordinarily popular with the modern day Japanese. That's not to say that there aren't exceptions. One little anecdote, our friend Norman Englund, who covered all the Millennium Godzilla films for Fangoria as well as Gamera 3 and various other Japanese genre films, when he was visiting the Daiei studios to cover the special effects filming for Gamera 3, there was a time where he was walking around with somebody who I think was in the PR department, and they saw a statue of Daimajin. And Norman asked the PR guy, hey, when's Daiei going to make a new Daimajin film? And the guy said to him something to the effect of, well, Jidaigeki is so expensive because of the elaborate costumes you got to make, the elaborate sets you got to make, that, studios just don't want to bankroll on it unless it's guaranteed to be successful.
However, if you look at sales, there's a series called Demon Slayer, which over the past 2 years sold more copies than the entire American comics industry combined.
And also the Demon Slayer movie recently became not just the highest grossing anime of all time, but the highest grossing Japanese film of all time. So it's definitely still popular.
I don't think that there's a lack of appetite for these sorts of stories. I think they might just be getting concentrated into your mega hits. The same deal with the Rurouni Kenshin movies, which just came out with their 5th film.
Rurouni Kenshin is probably the most well-known of all samurai anime out there, and although it was initially created in the 90s, it's still getting live-action adaptations even now.
So you see fewer titles, but the titles that do exist are quite popular. You also see a big trend of taking modern characters and putting them into a samurai period context. There's a Sengoku Gridman manga. You got Garo Crimson Moon, which was set in the Heian era. And this is also popular abroad. If you look at some of the co-produced titles, there was a direct-to-video movie called, in Japan it was called Ninja Batman, and in the US it's called Batman Ninja, where Batman travels back in time and becomes a ninja. You also have these Star Wars figures that are sort of redesigned to look like samurai. And Netflix just announced recently that there's going to be a sequel to their original film Bright that's animated and set in samurai times. So this is something that seems to be considered popular on the international stage, is taking these established modern characters and porting them into period pieces. And Godzilla's actually toyed with that idea before. You had the Rage Across Time, that comic anthology had Godzilla traveling through time, including a samurai time pieces. There was the big comic original Godzilla, had a piece called Late Muromachi Godzilla. You had a mobile game that was set in the Sengoku period. And there was also some plans when they thought that Yamato Takeru was going to be a big hit new franchise. There was talk about bringing Godzilla into that for one of the entries as well.
Before Takahashi, there was a proposal for a Godzilla Samurai mashup. Creative minds think alike, and I don't think Takahashi took this idea from anybody. I think just, again, creative minds, they get the same great ideas a lot, but who had the idea before him was actually Yukiko Takayama, who wrote Terror of Mechagodzilla. Should clarify, she did not have that idea back in 1975. It was just an idea that she had as a writer later in life. So in a 2010 interview with Todorama G-Fan number 91, Takayama was asked what scenario she would create for a new Godzilla film. Though she said she thought it was best to leave Godzilla to the next generation, she did say, if I had a chance, I would like to go back to the ancient time. Truly the ancient time. People always look at the future, but why don't we look back? For example, imagine the armored warriors fight with Godzilla. This is just a casual idea that popped into my head. A story like The Tale of the Kaiki would be good. The movie could have a princess from the Heian period and armored warriors. Godzilla could destroy the ancient palace or castle.
As for setting Godzilla in an era full of samurai, it isn't exactly a surprising idea to me because of the popularity of it. At the same time, I'm kind of put off by the idea because Godzilla is definitely more of a modern creation, and I think it'd look a bit silly having him surrounded by very short buildings.
If you look at Daimajin, which is sort of the major kaiju of samurai films, he's only about 4 meters tall, and Godzilla is 50 meters tall at the smallest, and he kind of dwarfed the scale of buildings that existed at that time. So you'd have to work around things like that in order to make the narrative kind of work together.
I don't think Godzilla, the villain, would work back then because he would just obliterate, everybody so easily. I think what would work better would be more of a Godzilla the hero type story. Maybe the good Godzilla gets sent back in time for some reason and has to fight some bad monster from that time period, which I guess sounds a little bit like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, so maybe that's not the best comparison.
From that night that Takahashi pitched Sawada the Godzilla vs. Samurai idea, it would be a full 2 years before the director would get back to the music composer about the project. Then 2019 rolled around and Takahashi told me that we would be moving on with the production of Godzilla. He also told me that the setting had changed from the Edo period to the near future, and that he had asked EnJoe-san to write the script, Sawada said in the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook. So why was the Godzilla vs. Samurai idea dropped? Well, a possibility could be due to something called the Godzilla Method. There's something called the Godzilla Method, Director Takahashi described on the Episode 1 Blu-ray commentary of Godzilla Singular Point. Godzilla can't die, you can't have Godzilla eat, and you can't change Godzilla's shape. From John DeBont to Shinji Higuchi, directors on both sides of the Pacific have described a similar set of rules over the decades, guidelines that Toho has in place to preserve both the appearance and character of Godzilla itself.
We all know from the production of the 1998 Godzilla movie that Toho has a set of rules for dealing with Godzilla. Apparently there's over 70 pages worth. It's not clear how much those have changed over time, but there are all sorts of things like Godzilla must have 4 toes, Godzilla doesn't eat people, Godzilla must have 3 rows of dorsal spikes and cannot die, and things like that. That said, Toho has certainly changed these rules or ignored them selectively in the past themselves, so it might be one of those situations like when you tell a babysitter, I don't want my kids eating candy, but then it's okay if I feed my kids candy.
An interesting story is when Shinji Higuchi came to G-Fest in 2017, he was talking about, in one of his interviews, how they were approaching the idea of Godzilla evolving. That was something that he and Anno had wanted to do basically from day one. And initially they pitched the idea of Godzilla starting off looking like Godzilla and then evolving into something completely new and different. And Toho said, well, we don't really want you to do that because that's kind of like, against how we want to have Godzilla portrayed. So they compromised by, doing the reverse, having Godzilla start off looking completely unlike he'd ever done before, but by the middle of the film, it looks a lot more closer to the standard Godzilla design, what have you.
Eventual series composer Toh EnJoe described additional rules of the so-called Godzilla Method in an interview to Gigazine.net, including one that might have killed the Godzilla Samurai plot on arrival. There was a lot of talk about, please don't eat people, EnJoe explained. It's okay to bite other monsters, but please let us know when you eat them. And please don't show Godzilla in the time before the first movie. Avoiding problematic and controversial parts of Japan's own history could be the reason this particular rule exists. Look no further than Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah.
A gigantic dinosaur is attacking our boys! A dinosaur? What?
Its scenes of 1944-era American soldiers being taken out by the Godzillasaurs sparked anger overseas after American trash show Entertainment Tonight caught wind of it and ran a piece calling the film anti-American. Real or not, one can understand why Toho would want to avoid any kind of international controversy that could negatively affect its product. Yes, the horrors of World War II are a far different subject than that of the Edo period, but who knows how chronologically expansive this rule was, let alone if it was even the thing that ultimately killed the Godzilla vs. Samurai concept. However, this ghost of an idea still haunts the 13 episodes of Godzilla Singular Point. From the gigantic mural in Episode 1 to Goro Otaki's constant quoting of kabuki plays, it still is very much within the fabric of the show's story. With the Godzilla vs Samurai plot out the window, Takahashi continued on to imagine new scenarios, and his next idea would require the expertise of a physicist. Toh EnJoe is a multiple award-winning science fiction author, has a PhD in mathematical physical study on the natural languages, and graduated from Tohoku University as a physicist.
I love this quote from the literary journal Asymptote. Toh EnJoe's stories are known for their scientific lucidity and literary impenetrability. His language and writing style, however, belie his background as a physicist. Topics woven into his stories include science, but also linguistics, literary theory, and philosophical approaches to the imagination. His complicated narrative structures are the subject of heated discussions and have evoked harsh reviews calling his work indigestible, sleep-inducing, and reader-unfriendly. And I can't disagree with any of that.
I feel like in order to understand an EnJoe work, you sort of either need to be EnJoe himself or need to have the same background in science and literature as him. It's kind of perfect that EnJoe entered the anime industry as a writer because there's a deep, definite niche that he can fill that few others can. It's a little hard to explain, but many anime fans tend to love series that go deep into scientific exposition and philosophical musings. It's one of the reasons that Ghost in the Shell and Neon Genesis Evangelion have continued to stay popular. And EnJoe even wrote a tie-in collection of short stories for Ghost in the Shell.
Though he had some experience in the manga field with the Empire of Corpses, he hadn't any screenwriting experience until the president of Studio Bones, Masahiko Minami, called him to work on a few episodes of the space set series Space Dandy. Upon first being asked, EnJoe expressed no interest. But then, Mr. Minami asked me to come to Tokyo for a while, and when I went there, I couldn't say no anymore. Space Dandy had also been a show Atsushi Takahashi worked on as a storyboard artist and director. Takahashi, impressed with EnJoe's work on Space Dandy, even asked the writer to pen his 2017 Doraemon movie, but EnJoe declined. Now, with the Godzilla project at hand, Takahashi truly believed that EnJoe's inclusion would make things interesting. So, at his request, in July of 2017, Masahiko Minami once again phoned EnJoe with a question. How do you feel about Godzilla? Intrigued, EnJoe traveled once again to Tokyo where he met with the project's staff. Their offer was for EnJoe to act as a series composer, a key writing position that would formulate the overall story concept and key moments within the anime series. EnJoe would also act as a sort of science advisor, because director Takahashi had decided to take a contemporary science fiction approach to the story. Mr. Takahashi wanted us to have a solid science fiction foundation, EnJoe told Gigazine.net. He thought it was time to stop saying that the monsters became huge after being exposed to radiation. History was about to repeat itself. As EnJoe sat there, surrounded by the Godzilla anime staff, I was like, isn't there any way out of this? I felt like I was being summoned. And I said, I have to do this, don't I? EnJoe laughed. EnJoe accepted the job, and for the next 3 years, he and Takahashi would contemplate and design their Godzilla story. Many of these scenarios, as you'll soon hear, aren't just overly familiar copy-paste plots featuring Godzilla. There's usually some small complexity or intriguing angle. However, there was one concept that Toh EnJoe has mentioned on multiple occasions, and this idea sounds way less like a Takahashi EnJoe joint and more like another early studio pitch, and it was something that neither director or series composer thought was a good idea. Popularized from Ultraman to Neon Genesis Evangelion, the Kaiju of the Week scenario is a well-worn story format, and it was proposed early on that the new Godzilla anime series should take such a direction.
Anime, as it currently stands, in a way came out of tokusatsu traditions. If you look at Devilman and Cutie Honey and Mazinger Z, those are all Monster of the Week shows because those were emulating the popular Monster of the Week shows that were on, like Ultraman and Kamen Rider. There's been a move away from that starting in the 80s towards a more serialized approach to television where a threat might recur over multiple episodes. And you see this both in the tokusatsu world and in animation.
So Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen are two of the more popular ones that do that sort of thing where they have to face a new enemy every few episodes. So it's not Monster of the Week, but Monster of the every few weeks.
As tokusatsu still has a little bit of a younger skewing audience, it tends to be a little bit more Monster of the Week still and animation tends to be a little bit more serialized now. But it's very much a retro thing to have the idea of a monster of the week. So if you look at shows that are throwbacks, a great example would be The Big O in that first season. Every episode is very self-contained because it's trying to emulate the feeling of a classic sort of 60s era television show.
On the Kaiju of the Week idea, EnJoe said, "Neither me or Mr. Takahashi liked it." He further elaborated on his problems with it in his interview with Gigazine.net. The show can be structured as a series of short stories, since each story has to end in 30 minutes. It's just a question of how to make it. 13 episodes is very difficult. If you're talking about Ultra monsters, you can have one monster per episode and have it be defeated by Ultraman. But in Godzilla, for example, if Rodan comes out and is defeated in the first episode, and then Anguirus comes out and is defeated in the second episode, people will say, it's not supposed to be like this. The Kaiju of the Week idea would also go against EnJoe and Takahashi's creative desire to keep Godzilla from appearing too much within the series. I thought it would be boring if Godzilla appeared every 2 episodes, or 6 times out of 13 episodes, EnJoe stated to Asahi.com, further elaborating that an Ultraman or Evangelion type approach would be difficult to structure.
Toho EnJoe thought that the idea of a monster of the week was boring. And if the writer thinks that something will be boring, if they're going to be the one writing it, it will be boring.
Monster of the Week shows tend to focus more on the development of the characters, and that probably wouldn't have left much room for EnJoe to explore the science of the series, and I think he likes having characters that are already smart enough to handle the roles they're given rather than develop into those roles.
I wholeheartedly agree with the idea that it would have been kind of boring if it was just a Monster of the Week type show. Because as much as I love Ultraman, and I'll usually watch all of them, it does get a little bit repetitive.
A Monster of the Week show can still be done very, very well. And in cases of programs like Ultraman, they tend to be some of the most memorable episodes that just stand on their own and have their own start and ending and have a distinct message and moral and artistic vision behind them. It's much more difficult from a production standpoint to come up with multiple stories that are all going to be unique and interesting, when instead you can have one overarching narrative that you stretch over several episodes.
If it had been, the Monster of the Week, that probably would have made a lot of fans happier, certain types of fans, but I enjoyed the mystery of Singular Point. That's more what I'm into when it comes to a TV show, so I'm glad that's what they did.
It is entirely possible that this Kaiju of the Week pitch was the same one that director Takahashi had heard in his initial job interview, that being the scenario involving Godzilla fighting monsters worldwide. But one would have to believe that story dead after Takahashi's disinterest in it, the subsequent creation of other story proposals, and the hiring of Toho EnJoe to help with the series' new sci-fi direction. But by the time EnJoe joined the production, the idea had either survived, had been reworked, or was just an entirely new, similar-sounding concept. Whatever the case, neither key creative thought much of it, and they moved on in trying to find the right tale to tell. How many times the Godzilla anime team would meet to discuss the direction of the story is up to debate. Director Takahashi told Uchisan magazine that they had 2 or 3 training camps to work out the plot. Meanwhile, series composer EnJoe recounted that he, director Takahashi, producer Yoshizawa, and the heads of Studio Bones and Orange met every 2 weeks at Toho Studios. Upon his second meeting with director Takahashi, EnJoe was presented with the director's creative vision for the Godzilla anime series, a proper sci-fi story like the movie Arrival, which had just been recently released in Japan. I told him that Godzilla would never be like Arrival. If you think about it, Godzilla can't be like Arrival, can it? EnJoe mused in his Gigazine.net interview. After some back and forth discussion, we decided, well, let's think in that direction. It's not like we were trying to work out the details then, EnJoe laughed. The sci-fi feel of Arrival would be a key ingredient in formulating the final setting and story for Godzilla Singular Point. The other key ingredients would be a puzzle-like mystery for the characters to solve, and a highly realistic feel overall. Were these ideas initially pitched by Takahashi from the start, along with the sci-fi feel of Arrival, or did director and story composer gradually stumble across them somewhere over the 3 years of developing Singular Point's story? It's really hard to say. For this video, we're going with the idea that they gradually came across each key story point and fleshed it out as they went along. With that said, from the start, alongside the idea of having an Arrival-like sci-fi feel, was Takahashi's desire for a puzzle-like mystery to be present. Mr. Takahashi said, "I want it to be like Pulp Fiction." He said we wanted to combine those puzzle-like elements. It was a combination of the feeling of Arrival and some of the stories from Pulp Fiction, but it all ended up in one place, Toho EnJoe recalled. Takahashi requested that EnJoe come up with as many ideas as he possibly could. From there, the two would then consider how each idea could be visualized and if the idea could be made into an entertaining scenario. We had many ideas for the series, Takahashi said in the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook, but the process was difficult. For one, since so much had already been done with the nearly 70-year-old Godzilla franchise, coming up with new ideas was challenging. And secondly, director Takahashi was in a constant game of tug-of-war with his series composer. The director has a very careful style. When I try to go too far, Mr. Takahashi pulls me back to sanity while playing tug-of-war with me, EnJoe said to Uchi-sen magazine. In that same issue of Uchi-sen, Takahashi explained that Mr. EnJoe would come up with ideas that could never be visualized. One can only imagine what kind of crazy, impossible scenarios EnJoe dreamt up, but we may know of at least one. A Godzilla anime without Godzilla. If we are to take Toho EnJoe at his word, this was an idea that actually had some discussion behind it at one point. There are absolutely no details about this outside of a pair of quotes from EnJoe about the matter. There was a proposal not to show him, EnJoe laughed during his interview with New Type magazine. There was an idea in the beginning that Godzilla may not appear, but we decided not to do that this time, EnJoe told Yahoo News Japan.
I don't think you can have a Godzilla anime without Godzilla in it. I mean, he's right there in the title.
I kind of love the idea of doing a Godzilla movie in which Godzilla doesn't actually appear. I think that this is something that could be done quite well because the world in which Godzilla inhabits has so many kooky, off-the-wall things going on, and there's so many things that can be extrapolated from the notions of what would happen if we had monsters running around, what would happen if we had aliens that we had to fight wars against and be diplomatic with, and so on and so forth.
I wonder if it's more likely they meant something along the lines of like a spin-off where it would feature a lot of Toho monsters other than Godzilla. Even though they weren't great, I loved the idea that Toho did that Mothra trilogy in the late 90s. I just loved that they did it, even though the movies weren't that good. I'm supportive of the idea if it was like meant to enrich the Godzilla universe.
There have been some examples in the past, like the 1998 movie, The Great Monster Makes Landfall in Tokyo, is a kaiju movie where no kaiju actually do appear.
A riot is an ugly thing, and I think that it is just about time that we had one!
That said, I think that fandom would receive this very, very poorly and generally speaking would not like it. You would have a few people that were on board for something like that. But usually when the general audience goes to something called Godzilla, they get restless when Godzilla is not on screen.
Again, we can only speculate what this idea might have looked like, let alone as to why it was considered in the first place. But here is something to think about. Both director Takahashi and series composer EnJoe have discussed in various interviews how difficult they found it to properly time the appearance of Godzilla in their 13-episode series. They have even gone as far as calling it the most challenging part in developing the story. In a movie, Godzilla should appear at the height of the story, but if you apply that theory to the TV series, you'll end up with a lot of stories without Godzilla. It was difficult to find a balance between the two, Takahashi told Uchi-sen magazine. Could EnJoe's no Godzilla scenario have been an out-of-the-box solution to their creative dilemma? We don't know when to show Godzilla in the stories, so what if we just don't show Godzilla at all? EnJoe did have less extreme ideas, of course, like the one where Godzilla would go around Japan destroying famous monuments. There was also talk of having the story set in a very familiar Japanese setting. Director Takahashi confirmed to Uchi-sen magazine that Toho EnJoe proposed the idea of setting the Godzilla anime at a school. Again, details are scarce, but EnJoe told Yahoo News Japan that in the story, Godzilla would act as a typhoon, a disaster that would come about once a year. I insisted on the story seriously, but I didn't get a very good reception, EnJoe said laughing.
Schools are actually a hugely pervasive setting in Japanese animation, to an extent more than any other country's media that I've seen.
It is absolutely a very omnipresent thing throughout the course of Japanese media. And it's really interesting looking at the history of Japanese films, seeing how the classroom setting has been used. I'm thinking mainly in terms of the 1940s. During the time of the war, you had Japanese films that were set in the classroom, in which the teacher-student relationship was being used used to help young people become ready to serve the nation. There's films like Shimizu Hiroshi's Introspection Tower about problem kids being sent to a reform school. And you have scenes in that film like, the kids giving their morning pledges, talking about serving the emperor. And also you have that sort of classroom setting appearing in a very different kind of way in the very explicit wartime propaganda films. Films like Toward the Decisive Battle in the Sky, The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, for example. Flashing forward to the back half of the 1940s, this is Japan has surrendered and you now have the occupation. More importantly, you have the occupation trying to quote-unquote democratize the nation. And part of that whole strategy was the censorship of Japanese media, including films. And so now we have the occupation censors recommending democratic subjects and democratic topics to the filmmakers. I'm thinking in particular of a two-part film from 1947, I think, called Blue Mountains, directed by Imai Tadashi, and starring Hara Setsuko. Hara Setsuko in this film plays a democratic teacher who works in a town that has very antiquated ways of thinking, read pre-World War II ways of thinking, especially about young women and their relationship to boys. And so here comes this vibrant young teacher who's telling her students and telling their parents and the community, hey, it's okay for young girls to have relationships and so on and so forth. Very democratic ideas being pushed for by the occupation, and you have films, again, using the classroom setting to push that idea.
There's definitely a strong youth culture in Japan where the idea is that once you're an adult, you kind of get a salaryman job or you settle down and become a stay-at-home mom. So the idea is that the time of your life is really during your school years.
It's not just universally relatable for viewers, but you can also play around with the genres quite a lot. A sports show can easily take place in a high school, or you can change the school to have a focus on teaching magic for a fantasy series. Having a series set in a school can also be convenient to force different types of personalities together that normally wouldn't be near each other, which is good for creating friction and drama.
So the idea of Godzilla popping up like a force of nature to terrorize the area around a certain school, I can't tell you how much I hate that idea. It sounds like it would even be a hard sell for me as just a little IDW comic miniseries. And I'm not saying I always have to see Godzilla fighting other monsters, but, I'm a little tired of, Godzilla, he's just a force of nature and here he comes. And that's why I like Singular Point. There was a lot of mystery as to what he is and what he's going to do, how are they going to defeat him. Definitely don't like the school concept.
When going with anime as your choice of medium, I think it makes sense to go with one of the cliched archetypes that you'd see in Japanese animation, which is usually the high school students, rather than your usual tokusatsu staples, a reporter, a scientist, etc., etc. I think that the idea of Godzilla appearing on an annual basis is actually very reminiscent of a game called Attack of the Friday Monsters, which is sort of a mystery set in a small town where the main characters are trying to figure out why monsters attack every week, specifically on a Friday. It's very kind of a fun deconstruction of the whole Ultraman format.
I'm not too sure about the idea of Godzilla as a yearly natural disaster in that sort of setting. For EnJoe in particular, I think it would have forced him to do a lot more character development and taken away from the science, as I said before. So I don't think he would have enjoyed that either.
EnJoe addressed that one of the problems with the school setting was by having the characters be too young, it would be challenging to the narrative that they were trying to create. This is why they were eventually updated to college age in the final draft of Singular Point's story. One also wonders if nostalgia maybe played any role in EnJoe dreaming up the school setting. He had been in junior high when he saw his first Godzilla movie, Godzilla 1984 after all, and the film left a strong impression on him. But if nostalgia didn't have a role in that idea's creation, it certainly did with the next one. Determining the setting of the Godzilla anime would allow the rest of the story's pieces to fall into place. Though nobody thought much of EnJoe's school scenario, the pitch that involved setting the story around a place of education where Godzilla acted as a yearly natural disaster, one wonders if that got the team thinking about back when they were kids, watching Kaiju Eiga unfold in theaters and on their home televisions. Nostalgia is a hell of a drug in global pop culture, so it's of little surprise that the creative team considered returning to the so-called Kaiju Golden Age. The Showa era of Japan refers to the 60-plus year reign of Emperor Hirohito from 1926 to 1989. In the world of Godzilla, it describes the 15 motion pictures that were created from 1954 to 1975. There was talk about giving the Godzilla anime a Showa-era feel, even going so far as possibly setting the story squarely in that time, as producer Yoshizawa revealed to CG World magazine.
The Showa era, this really, when it gets referred to, is usually talking about the reconstruction after World War II and the Japanese economic miracle, when the recovery was coming about. This is when Japan was really fully embracing Western culture, and they were rising as a modern nation, and they were getting a lot of both economic and soft power around the world as the culture was really developing and flourishing. There's a lot of nostalgia for this period because it's a time when it seemed like anything was possible. And from a kaiju perspective, this is also when you had the big kaiju boom and then later the big superhero boom, where you got way more giant monster material and way more superhero material than you ever got again in Japan.
When the first Godzilla film was made in 1954, the Japanese film industry was in very good shape. Attendance for Japanese films domestically was very strong, and the domestic audience in Japan for Japanese films was very strong. Only 4 years after the first Godzilla, that was when Japan hit its all-time high in terms of attendance. So in 1958, more people went to go see movies in Japan than any other point in Japanese film history.
The Showa period is associated a lot with World War II, so it can be quite difficult to depict it sensitively. Most shows that I can think of that are set in that period, which were written more towards the modern day, they tend to have either a very serious vibe to them, or they have very big names behind them. That it's not just something anybody can really do, I find.
So I'm surprised they initially talked about setting this in the Showa era, because understanding the story for the characters was dependent on them using cell phones and text messages. But I will say, I kind of wish that Toho would actually do some animes set not just in the Showa era, but maybe in the Showa continuity. Maybe something light that doesn't upset fans, like nothing that's a great big departure from the mythos. Or maybe even better yet, what I really wish they do is find some of the better unproduced Godzillas, like Bride of Godzilla. I mean, the naked robot and all that would probably work well for anime. So I really wish Toho would look back on these unproduced scripts as templates for some new anime. I think that would be really cool.
I think that the Showa era would be an interesting period to revisit for a modern creator to take on, because there's all sorts of aspects that a production actually made in the Showa period without the benefit of hindsight might not recognize. And I think that there's interesting social aspects that could be explored there that wouldn't have necessarily been produced at the time, especially if you're talking about in the Showa era Godzilla stuff. Particularly, a lot of things were made for young children, and you can deal with headier issues. Some of the movies do, but there are all sorts of aspects, the Vietnam War, the student riots, things like that. These could be brought in as a backdrop for a Godzilla movie that can be interestingly done with the benefit of hindsight.
While Singular Point didn't end up in the Showa era, imagery and references remained throughout. This rings especially true in Episode 1's opening scenes of the Summer Festival, in which the filmmakers wanted a sort of Showa-era feel, with the opening to feel somewhat like a Katakawa film. The Katakawa film feel is a reference to Daiei Studios, the creators of Gamera and Daimajin, who merged with the Katakawa Corporation in 2002 and later re-emerged as Katakawa Daiei Pictures in 2004. While kaiju fans may best know them for the previously mentioned Gamera and Daimajin films, the film company also released a lot of Kaiki Eiga, or strange films, back during its peak years in the Showa era. An excellent explanation of what exactly Kaiki Eiga is comes from a dissertation by Michael E. Crandall titled Nightmares from the Past, Kaiki Eiga and the Dawn of Japanese Horror Cinema. These are domestic horror movies based on classic Edo period ghost stories, as well as imported pictures like Dracula and Frankenstein. They were a mainstay of commercial genre cinema in Japan from the silent era through the 1960s, and wielded an influence on the so-called J-horror pictures that achieved worldwide success at the turn of the millennium. Subsequently, Kaiki Eiga would be released during the hot summer months, when audiences needed chills to cool them down. For the first couple episodes we had in mind something kind of nostalgic, said Takahashi on the Episode 1 Blu-ray commentary. like the kind of film they'd play in the Japanese summer holidays, kind of like horror or ghostly, that kind of thing. Though nostalgia was strong with the Showa era, there was little denying that setting the series in modern times, or the near equivalent of such, could also be a great decision, and the team began to think in that direction thanks to the most successful motion picture in Godzilla's contemporary history. If you recall, Shin Godzilla's massive success caused Toho to change course concerning the original Godzilla anime project, transforming the intended 13-episode television series into 3 theatrical films. Beyond this, Shin Godzilla had little creative influence on the Godzilla anime trilogy, a project that had years' worth of development behind it before Shin ever came along. The same cannot be said, however, for the then-yet titled Godzilla Singular Point. Chronologically speaking, this production would technically be the first Japanese Godzilla project conceived in a post-Shin Godzilla world, and with Singular Point's production still in the embryonic stages, it would be impossible for Shin Godzilla to not somehow affect it. The influence of Shin Godzilla was huge, Toh EnJoe told Kaiju.net. The final 13 episodes of Singular Point would go on to feature many homages to Shin Godzilla. The show even repurposed abandoned or early ideas left over from Shin, such as the multiple form life cycle of Godzilla Ultima, and the King of the Monsters metamorphosis from Godzilla Amphibia to Godzilla Terrestris. But Shin Godzilla's biggest contribution to Singular Point was the high level of reality in its story's presentation. Director Takahashi, a self-admitted fan of Shin Godzilla, very much liked this idea, and it would eventually be applied to every part of Singular Point's narrative, from how the public would likely refer to a kaiju as a dinosaur upon first seeing one, to the depiction of how time would pass in the story itself. For example, to travel from Tokyo to Dubai, you have to take a plane. That requires travel time, and there is also a time difference. I wanted to depict such details without being vague, said Takahashi. This high level of reality, along with a science fiction approach and a puzzle-like mystery, would be the 3 key ingredients in helping Takahashi and EnJoe form the final story outline of Godzilla Singular Point. But still, what story to tell? They pondered more on Shin Godzilla, wondering if they should stay close to the events and ideas presented in that film, including accurately representing the government's response to a monster attack. But the director, Atsushi Takahashi, said, "Who can do that? There was no one on staff who was familiar with the political system," Toh EnJoe said to Kaiju.net. In the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook, EnJoe made similar remarks regarding a lack of anyone on staff knowing how the government worked, adding, "Technical topics are very delicate after all." Had the Godzilla anime production even had access to a political expert, EnJoe conceded to Bunga Kokai magazine that had they gone this route, there is no way to surpass Shin Godzilla. He also addressed how the huge number of characters that made up Shin Godzilla's cast would make the scenario impossible for a project like this. Due to budget constraints, the number of characters that could be created was limited, and there was no room to increase the number of characters on the government side.
Capitalizing on the success of Shin Godzilla seems like an obvious move for Toho to make going into the production of Godzilla Singular Point, but it is kind of perilous because if you don't have the same people involved, something like getting Kara on board, then you might wind up in a situation where what you come across is derivative and sort of a knockoff.
I'm not really a fan of that idea because I feel like we'd just be retreading the same thing that Shin Godzilla already did. There was also another anime called Japan Sinks, which came out in 2020 on Netflix, which actually covered a natural disaster in Japan, supposedly in a realistic manner. I haven't seen it myself, but because of the similarities with that and the fact it was also going to Netflix, that might be why they ended up dropping the idea.
I think it's funny because I thought of Shin Godzilla as I watched Singular Point, because to me it does still have a lot of government involvement, even though it's not like Hideki Anno's commentary on the government's ineptitude in Shin Godzilla. You know, there is still a lot of involvement from the government in Singular Point, and Godzilla is also, for lack of a better word, kind of weird and non-traditional.
One of the strengths of the Godzilla franchise has always been mixing things up and doing something different than has previously been done. And from that perspective, I think it was a good move to take Singular Point in a very different direction than Shin Godzilla, while still maintaining the kind of very well thought out scripting and aspirations of making Godzilla something loftier that Shin Godzilla really popularized.
And then there was also the matter of differentiating this new Godzilla anime from the rest of the Reiwa Godzilla entries. Even though Shin Godzilla was a hit, we wanted to pursue newness, we couldn't create the same kind of setting, director Takahashi explained to Asahi.com. It was also necessary to differentiate the series from the Godzilla Anime trilogy produced by Polygon Pictures. This is why Takahashi and EnJoe opted to set their story in the near future of 2030. Pretty close to the modern times of Shin Godzilla, which they wanted to stick closely to, and about 20,000 years too early for the apocalyptic futurescape of the Godzilla Anime trilogy. The show would take 2 years to make, so if we set it in present times, it would be outdated by the time it aired, Takahashi was quoted as saying to Anime Times. And we wouldn't know what would happen 100 years from now, so we thought 10 years from now would be good. Finally, the Godzilla anime had its setting, but again, what story to tell? By mid-2018, they finally found it. Director Takahashi had finally come up with the earliest form of Godzilla Singular Point's story, a rough idea that he soon presented to EnJoe. I wanted people from many different places to gather pieces of a puzzle, and that Godzilla had to be defeated once all the pieces had been gathered. This plotline would feature 7 or 8 characters, each holding a piece of the overarching plot's puzzle, and as the show progressed, the mysteries of the story would gradually be solved as the characters exchanged their puzzle pieces with one another. The story would also feature the characters having a number of near misses, missing each other by that much and never actually meeting face to face in the story, something that sounds very much like Pulp Fiction, one of Takahashi's initial creative influences. This idea carried on into the final version of Singular Point, where the show's protagonists, Mei and Yoon, almost meet each other in the first few episodes, but don't actually do so until the final minutes of the show's end. But as we were doing it, it proved to be difficult in practice to have all of these protagonists, Toh EnJoe said on the Episode 1 Blu-ray commentary. So we went with the double protagonists. I still think it would have been easier to do as an omnibus at the end of the day, Takahashi replied.
Omnibus-style storytelling there are a couple of different ways to think about it. Most commonly, it's used for when you're adapting something like a light novel, which is sort of a form of video game, and you have multiple paths that your character can take. So what they would tend to do is they would tell one character's storyline and then tell another character's storyline. And sometimes this involves completely resetting the story at the beginning, and sometimes it just is telling one character's story all the way through and then telling another character's story all the way through, and you sort of see how they interact with each other.
Hyperlinked cinema fits more in line with what I think Takahashi may have been talking about. So hyperlinked cinema is like a loose reference to internet browsing, where one keeps clicking on links and they have a bunch of tabs open and keep going between them, something like that. Sometimes the characters start off together and then they separate, or they start out separate, but a story will keep jumping between the characters and playing with time, keeping each relatively separate until they eventually come together and all is revealed to the audience. We do see something like that in Singular Point with Yoon and Mei, since they don't meet in person until the very end. And I do think they kept the idea of hyperlinked cinema, but just kept it and simplified it.
Given that there is a tendency to play around with time travel concepts in Toh EnJoe's work, I do wonder what the thought process was there, whether they wanted to do something that tells a story and then completely resets. An example of this would be something like Erased, which is a series that has an anime version and a live action version on Netflix, where a character is a time travel and he basically resets things. An American analog would be The Butterfly Effect. Or if they wanted to do something sort of focusing on individual characters, telling a single story, but focusing on one character at a time and giving their individual narratives in the style of Pulp Fiction. I think that either way, Toh EnJoe would have done an interesting job with it, and there's an argument to be made that Singular Point might be viewed as a very small omnibus production because you do have sort of multiple interlocking stories, but they are not done entirely Yoon's story and then entirely Mei's story, and as one goes, you see how it interacted with the other.
In a 13-episode Godzilla series, I don't know that I see that working. I do like that type of storytelling because I feel like I saw it a little bit in Game of Thrones, where you have all these characters a lot of times that don't actually ever interact with each other, and then there's a huge payoff when these characters finally meet.
I think they would have had to have dragged the episodes out a lot more, so they might have had to go to 24 episodes instead of what we got, and that might have ended up being really tedious for an anime. I feel like it works much better in a movie format.
I would be willing to check this sort of format out, done with a Godzilla series. It's not necessarily my preferred format when it comes to animation. A lot of that is, again, due to usually it's adapting source material that isn't really my sort of jam. You know, if it's adapting like a dating simulator and it's about what if Hikaru-kun picks Minami-chan, what if Hikaru-kun picks Maruko-chan, and something like that, and then telling their whole story as though you're going down that route. So those types of stories don't interest me as much, but you can definitely do interesting things with that. But I think that the decisions that were made were probably for the best when it came to parsing that down for Singular Point.
While the Omnibus narrative style perhaps would have been easier, as director Takahashi suggested, the overarching story wasn't quite decided yet, EnJoe reminded the director. We couldn't carve it up properly into an omnibus. It's at this point that the story of our little series, the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point, ends. But Godzilla Singular Point's story truly begins. Having finally hit upon the basic concept for the Godzilla anime, director Takahashi and series composer EnJoe, who would later become Singular Point's scriptwriter, would continue to draft, tinker, and design the narrative for another 2 years, from mid-2018 to July of 2020, when the story was at last finalized into the show we know today. At some point, maybe we'll visit that time period of Singular Point's history. The 2 years of drafts, rewrites, production deadlines, producer doubts, and more. That's another story for another video for another time. I very much hope you enjoyed the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. I need to thank Kevin Derendorf, John LeMay, Patrick Galvan, and Rainey for lending their expertise, as well as to all of my super chatters who donated generously over the past few months. A lot of time, money, and effort was put in by all involved in order to make this a reality, and it's something I'm truly grateful for. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.